When I was in high school, I wanted to go to this one dance. I think it was winter formal or something. So I begged my parents to buy me fancy clothes. I'm talking Gucci and all the big names, because I thought that would make the girls want to dance with me, right? So my parents spent money they didn't really have. I showed up to the dance, and guess how many girls I danced with? This many. Meanwhile, there were guys there barely dressed up who were dancing with girls all night. My confidence was wrecked, and also thank you, Katie, for dancing with me. I will never forget that. Sorry for being a shitty dancer. Now, I learned my lesson though, right? Absolutely not. I repeated this one mistake for the next decade, and that is trying to look rich. So in this video, you'll learn 4 lessons why it's important to look poor. By applying these lessons to your life, you'll be on a clear path to achieving what really matters, and that's owning your time. So in that story, I mentioned how my parents spent money they didn't really have, right? It turns out this was a common theme in our lives. Growing up, I always thought we were doing financially fine. But something more interesting was people on the outside thought we were doing well. A nice 4-bedroom house in a safe neighborhood, a German car in the driveway, the Gucci belt I wore to that dance. I think you can see a trend here. All of these things perfectly describe the first reason to avoid looking rich, and that's the financial implications. At my first job out of college, I had this awesome coworker named Eric who would always say, the poor buy liabilities and the rich buy assets. Liabilities are things that only take money from your wallet, while assets put money in your pocket. For example, Hellcats and Gucci belts are both liabilities, while index funds and real estate are assets. In most cases, people are borrowing money, aka going into debt, to pay for these liabilities. According to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, credit card balances in the US reached $1.2 trillion in 2024. It's worse for car loans, $1.6 trillion. That's a lot of zeros. Additionally, the median credit card interest rate, according to LendingTree, is 24%. And to illustrate how bad this is, let's say you use a credit card to buy a $500 Gucci belt, in hopes that it'll attract a certain group of people at a particular event. Is this the last Gucci belt reference? I guess you'll have to keep watching. Anyway, if you only make a $35 minimum payment each month, not only will it take you 18 months to pay it off, but you'll pay an additional $96 in interest. So you didn't pay $500 for that Gucci belt, you paid $596. If we run a similar calculation for a $72,000 Hellcat, assuming the numbers you see on screen now, you're paying over $8,000 in interest by the time the car is paid off. That also doesn't include insurance, fuel, maintenance, and depreciation. Speaking of losing value, the average new car depreciates 10% as soon as you leave the dealership, 20% after a year, and 50% in 5 years. And if we're talking BMWs and German cars, we're talking 60%. This is why cars are commonly considered liabilities, because not only do they cost you money, but they lose value over time, as opposed to assets. Also, fun fact, do you know the most common car driven by millionaires? It's not Lamborghinis or Ferraris or Bugattis. It's actually Hondas and Toyotas. So I'm sure you're starting to realize just how expensive it is to look rich, and there's an additional cost we haven't even talked about, and that is freedom. According to the Federal Reserve, nearly half of Americans don't have anything saved for retirement. Those who do aren't saving enough. People 65 and older have a median retirement account balance of only $200,000. If it costs them 50 grand per year to live, that money's not gonna last very long, even if it's being invested. This means these people will likely have to work until they die. If instead we invest that $1,300 Hellcat payment into an S&P 500 index fund for 25 years, we'd have around $1 million. After 40 years, $3 million. There are even ways to avoid paying taxes on some of that money. Now, investing does more than just put money in your pocket. The next reason why you want to avoid looking rich is something most people experience but aren't aware of, and that's the psychological implications. There are surveys from Bankrate and KeyBank that show that 50% of people reported that money has a negative impact on their mental health, including causing stress. A large part of this stress is related to the consumer debt we talked about earlier. Whether that's buying a Gucci belt with a credit card or borrowing money to buy a car you can't afford, you're increasing your stress levels by doing this. And it's not just stress, there's also an anxiety aspect to all this. What if I lose my job? What if I have an emergency expense? Or even deeper than that, what if people find out that I'm not actually rich? This is called imposter syndrome, and it can be crippling. But what if buying stuff makes you happy? Well, it turns out it doesn't. At least not for the long term. Imagine you buy a new skin for whoever you main in this game. For me, it's usually Bucky or Hella. So we buy the skin, we hop into a match, and man, feels pretty good. But then a week later, we're not unhappy, but we sort of return to this base state of happiness. It's like in this game, anytime we're not using our ultimate ability, we're in this sort of, base state. But when we pop our ulti, boom, now we're in this elevated state for a short period of time. This is called the hedonic treadmill or hedonic adaptation. It says that as humans, we tend to quickly return to a stable level of happiness despite major positive or negative events in our lives. In other words, our long-term happiness levels are fairly stable and will always return to a baseline. And that's despite how many video game skins, cars, or belts we buy. If that made no sense, here's the easy version. Constantly pursuing material wealth or status won't lead to lasting happiness. Instead, we should focus on the following strategies. Number one, investing in experiences over material possessions. A study by the University of Texas found that spending money on experiential purchases rather than material ones has a greater impact on people's happiness. So instead of buying designer clothes, go rent some kayaks with some friends during the day, then get sweaty with a few games of Rivals later that night. And remember, if it's just quick play, don't get mad, just breathe, but then blame the healers. I'm just kidding, I love the healers. Please heal me. Number two, pro-social acts of service, which is a fancy way of saying doing things for others or being selfless. Research shows that this is a reliable way to increase your capacity for long-term happiness. This could be volunteer work, charities, or even teaching people how to be good at Rivals. Number three, practicing mindfulness and gratitude. Various studies show that conscious breathing and being present can not only help ground you in the moment, but can also contribute to your overall well-being. So while you're kayaking with friends, get the hell off your phone and be present. If you start thinking about your problems, like not getting heals, focus on breathing. Then learn to reflect and appreciate events that change your life. Intentionally expressing thanks for a positive experience, like the two strategies we just talked about, is linked to increased happiness. Fourth, avoiding comparisons. Everybody knows this and how bad it is. But what most people don't know is that avoiding comparisons can help you desire less. Which makes sense, right? You see someone driving a car you don't have, or a graphics card that's not in your PC, and you start to think, man, I think I want this. And lastly, like we talked about earlier, investing your money. In a book called The Psychology of Money, the author says, the most important common denominator of happiness is simple. Having a strong sense of controlling one's life is a more dependable predictor of positive feelings of well-being than any other objective conditions of life we have considered. So in other words, if you save and invest enough money, you can decide to stop working, take a year off of work, start your own business, whatever. It's not so much about buying a Hellcat or Prada, as it is about having the means to do so, I suppose. Cool, so if we look poor, we can avoid many of the financial and psychological implications. But what about social issues? Now this one's interesting. First off, if you're trying to project this image of wealth, it might be hard to be yourself with people. You may avoid sharing things you're struggling with because, well, you're rich and life is good. I don't see how you're able to form genuine relationships with people because being vulnerable is a prerequisite. You may also experience being treated differently. For example, there's a survey from Pew Research Center that found that many Americans believe the rich are different than other people. While they're viewed as more intelligent and hardworking, they're also seen as greedier and less honest. From what I read, it seems to come more from the younger generations, which, given the state of the economy, kind of makes sense. Another interesting social implication revolves around relatability. Let's be real. It's already hard to make friends these days. If people can't relate to you because you're quote-unquote rich, I don't see how you'll make new friends or retain existing ones. If you do make friends, great, but you may run into lifestyle differences. For example, if you only go to expensive restaurants or pursue expensive activities, it's gonna be hard to hang with friends who can't or don't want to keep up, right? Imagine constantly being turned down by friends because of this, and nobody likes rejection. Even if you make friends with other rich people, there's a good chance you'll feel like an imposter, like we talked about earlier. Another interesting point, in my opinion, is trust. When you appear rich, you might be a bit paranoid, wondering if people like you for you, or if they're just looking for a human ATM, like a sugar mama or a sugar daddy. Anyway, second guess every new friendship? Nah, we're good. And actually, a recent study from Georgia State University found that people with money often struggle with trusting others, even in their closest relationships. So add all this up, and you start feeling alone. Your circle of friends gets smaller, and it becomes harder to build those meaningful connections that we as humans literally evolved to need, because we're social animals. We don't do well in solitary, and COVID-19 was proof of that. Now, the problem with everything we talked about so far is that life isn't black and white. In fact, technically as humans, we see around a million different colors. So let's be real and acknowledge a few caveats here. When I say look poor, I don't mean look homeless, eat nothing but packaged ramen, or let your pants fall down because I said don't buy a belt. It's about avoiding being flashy, buying things for the sake of what others think, and going into consumer debt over it. Now, if you can afford the purchase and it's for the right reasons, buy it. Because guys, don't wait until you're 65 years old to start enjoying life a little. Spend some money now. So avoid looking rich so you can actually be rich. And speaking of being rich, watch this video where I answer your juicy money questions while playing Marvel Rivals.